In the grim darkness of the far future, there are many ways a soul can be damned. Through corruption, through weakness, through the whispered promises of dark gods. But perhaps the cruelest damnation of all is the one that begins not with choice, but with sight, the ability to see what others cannot, to know what others are spared from knowing, to carry a burden of cosmic horror that no mortal mind was meant to bear. This is the story of Perturabo, the Iron Lord, the breaker of worlds, the architect of humanity's greatest victories and most bitter defeats. But before he did any of these things, before the siege engines and the demon prince's crown, he was simply a child who saw hell written across the stars. And that sight, that terrible, beautiful, damning sight, would strangle his soul piece by piece until nothing remained but iron and rage. The mountain peaks of Olympia pierced the sky like broken bones on the day he fell from the heavens, a golden child wrapped in thunder and fire, crashing into a world of city-states and endless war. The people who found him spoke of omens, of prophecies, of a gift from the gods themselves. They named him Perturabo, he who endures, and claimed him as their own. But from his very first breath on that harsh world, Perturabo saw what no other living soul could see. While others looked up at Olympia's night sky and saw only stars, constellations, the gentle dance of distant suns, he saw something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist, something that shouldn't be possible. He saw the Eye of Terror, a wound in reality itself, bleeding warp light and madness across the galaxy, a cosmic scar that had not yet been born, would not be born for thousands of years, yet somehow, impossibly, existed in a perception like a malignant star, a constant reminder that the universe was not what it seemed, that beneath the veneer of order and reason lay chaos absolute. Night after night, the young Primarch would stand on the palace balconies, his perfect mind struggling to process what his enhanced eyes revealed. Other children saw shooting stars and made wishes. Perturabo saw the slow death of reality and felt the weight of cosmic horror settling on his shoulders like a shroud. The learned men of Olympia tried to explain it away. Hallucinations, they said, the trauma of his arrival, the stress of his rapidly developing mind. But Perturabo knew better. He could feel it calling to him, whispering at the edges of his consciousness, promising answers to questions he didn't yet know how to ask. And so he learned, at an age when other children were playing with toys, that the universe was fundamentally broken, that order was an illusion, that everything beautiful, everything perfect, everything worth creating would eventually be consumed by the hungry darkness between the stars. This knowledge, this terrible, isolating knowledge, began to poison his soul from the very beginning. While his brother Primarch would later speak of destiny, of purpose, of their father's grand design, Perturabo had already seen the end, had already glimpsed the truth that would take the rest of the galaxy 10,000 years to understand. The Eye of Terror stared back at him every night, and slowly, inevitably, he began to stare back. The visions came with the knowledge, flashes of futures that might be, glimpses of wars unimaginable, cities burning, brothers fighting brothers, and always, always, the taste of iron in his mouth and the weight of chains around his heart. He saw himself older, harder, standing atop mountains of corpses he had built with his own hands. He saw fortresses that scraped the stars and siege engines that devoured worlds. But most terrible of all, he saw himself alone. Even as a child, Perturabo understood that sight comes with a price. To see truly is to lose innocence. To know the future is to be trapped by it, and to carry such knowledge alone, to be the only one who understands the cosmic joke that is existence, is to begin the slow process of spiritual strangulation. The other Primarchs would be found by their emperor in time. They would be given legions, given purpose, given the illusion that their actions mattered in the grand scheme of things. But Perturabo had already seen the Eye, had already glimpsed the truth that would make mockery of every victory, every sacrifice, every moment of hope. He was not just a Primarch. He was a prophet of ending, a child cursed with the sight of hell, trying to build heaven with hands that already knew how it would all crumble. And in Olympia, as the seasons turned and the wars raged and the young demigod learned to speak the language of mortals, that terrible knowledge began its work, building walls around his heart, forging chains for his soul, teaching him that to love something, to create something, to hope for something, was simply to give the darkness another target. The Eye of Terror watched him grow, watched him learn, watched him build his first fortress, not out of stone and steel, but out of bitterness and solitude. It would not be his last. There is a particular tragedy reserved for those who dream of paradise while standing in hell. It is not the tragedy of the fool who cannot see reality, but the genius who sees it all too clearly and still believes, against all evidence, that something beautiful can be built from the ashes. This was Perturabo's first sin. Not pride, not anger, not the bitterness that would later consume him. His first sin was hope, the desperate, defiant hope that maybe, just maybe, he could create something perfect enough to matter, something so beautiful that even the Eye of Terror would have to look away. On Olympia, as the young Primarch grew from child adolescent to towering demigod, his superhuman intellect turned not to weapons or warfare, but to creation. While other worlds might have forged their fallen angels into conquerors or tyrants, Perturabo became something far more dangerous. He became an architect of dreams. His mind was a cathedral of impossible mathematics, equations that sang like hymns, geometric theorems that unfolded like prayers to gods of order and beauty. Where others saw a mountain, he saw the perfect cathedral hidden within the stone, waiting to be liberated. Where others saw empty plains, he envisioned cities that would make the angels themselves weep with envy, and he began to build. The first structure rose when he was barely 12 Terran years old, though his enhanced physiology already towered over grown men. A simple bridge spanning the Cardes River, connecting two warring city-states that had feuded for generations. But this was no ordinary bridge. Every stone was placed with mathematical precision. Every arch is calculated to distribute weight in perfect harmony. Every decoration served both aesthetic and structural purpose in ways that the greatest architects of Olympia couldn't begin to comprehend. The bridge didn't just connect two shores. It connected two people. When merchants began crossing it, when families were reunited, when the old hatreds began to fade beneath the simple reality of easier passage, Perturabo felt something he had never experienced before, something that almost drowned out the whispers from the Eye of Terror. He felt useful, but the Eye was patient. It had watched civilizations rise and fall. It had seen hope kindle and die in the hearts of billions. It could wait for one small Primarch to learn the truth about creation in a universe built for destruction. The second project was a temple, not to any god in particular, but to the concept of the divine itself, a structure so perfectly proportioned that standing within it felt like touching something eternal. The mathematical ratios were based on principles that wouldn't be discovered by human science for millennia, pulled from the genetic memories encoded in his Primarch blood. Sacred geometry made manifest in marble and gold and light itself. When the temple was completed, pilgrims came from across Olympia. They wept, they prayed, they spoke of feeling closer to whatever gods they served simply by standing in the space Perturabo had created. For weeks, months, the young Primarch would walk through his temple at night, running his hands along walls that hummed with perfect acoustics, and almost believed that he had answered the Eye's challenge. See? His heart whispered, beauty exists, order exists, something perfect can be built that will last forever. The Eye of Terror pulsed with what might have been laughter. The third project was his masterpiece, a city not rebuilt from existing structures or modified from ancient foundations, but created from nothing, planned in his mind first as pure mathematical concept, then translated into reality through will and genius and desperate hope. He called it Lawcos, the Shining City. 7 districts arranged in perfect spiral, each building precisely positioned to create optimal airflow, sunlight distribution, defensive capability, and aesthetic harmony. Streets that curved like musical notes. Fountains that sang in mathematical progression. Gardens arranged according to principles of growth and decay that created perpetual beauty. It took him 3 years. 3 years of 16-hour days, of calculations that fill libraries, of directing thousands of workers with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. And when it was finished, when the last stone was placed and the last flower planted, Lawcos was perfect, truly perfect, for exactly 1 day. Because perfection, Perturabo learned, is not a static state. Perfection is a moment, a single point in time that begins deteriorating the instant it's achieved. The flowers grew too tall and upset the mathematical harmony. The fountains accumulated mineral deposits that changed their song. The people who moved into his perfect city brought their imperfect lives, their messy emotions, their unpredictable desires. They put up signs. They modified buildings. They wore paths in precisely calculated streets that deviated from the optimal routes by fractions of degrees that, accumulated over time, would destroy the city's entire mathematical foundation. And Perturabo watched his masterpiece die, not through malice or war or natural disaster, but through the simple fact of existence, through the reality that nothing perfect can survive contact with life itself. Standing in the central plaza of his dying dream, the young Primarch felt something break inside his chest, not his heart. That would break later more completely, in the arms of someone who loved him. No, what broke was his faith, his belief that creation could triumph over entropy, his hope that beauty had any meaning in a universe trending toward chaos. Above him, invisible to every other soul on Olympia, the eye of terror burned a little brighter, as if it were pleased, as if it had been waiting for this moment since the day he fell from the stars. Because now Perturabo understood the first law of existence. Everything beautiful dies. Everything perfect decays. And if you're going to build something in this universe, if you're going to impose your will on reality itself, you might as well build something that acknowledges this truth. You might as well build something designed to destroy. The architect of dreams looked up at the eye that only he could see, and for the first time in his life, he smiled back. There are wounds that cut flesh, and wounds that cut deeper. But the cruelest wounds of all are those inflicted by love given and love withheld. They fester in the soul long after the body is healed, poisoning every relationship that follows, turning every gesture of affection into a reminder of what was never offered freely. For Perturabo, this lesson began not with enemies or strangers, but with the man who called himself father. Damkos, tyrant of Lawcos, was many things. A cunning politician, a ruthless general, a pragmatist who understood that power was not inherited but seized and held through careful calculation. What he was not, what he could never be, was the father that a Primarch needed. And in that failure, in that cold, transactional relationship, the seeds of Perturabo's later damnation took root. When the golden child fell from the sky, Damco saw opportunity. Not a son, not a blessing from the gods, but a weapon of unimaginable potential wrapped in the flesh of a boy. He took Perturabo into his household, not from love, but from ambition, clothed him, educated him, gave him a name and a place, and never once let him forget that it was all conditional. You are here because you are useful, Damkos would say during their cold, formal dinners. Prove your worth, and you will be rewarded. Fail me, and you will learn what happens to disappointments in my house. Other fathers might have seen the genius blazing behind those ancient eyes and nurtured it, might have recognized the desperate need for approval, for belonging, for some sign that he was wanted rather than merely tolerated. But Damkos was not other fathers. He was a tyrant who had survived decades of Olympian politics by never showing weakness, never revealing affection, never giving anything that could be used against him later. And so Perturabo learned to hunger, not for food or comfort or material things, but for something far more precious and far more dangerous. He learned to hunger for love that had to be earned, for approval that came with conditions, for a father's pride that was doled out like payment for services rendered. The young Primarch threw himself into his studies with desperate intensity. Languages learned in days, mathematical concepts mastered in hours, military strategies absorbed and improved upon before he had seen his first battle. He rebuilt half of Lawcos, designed siege engines that made the city impregnable, composed poetry that would have made ancient Terra's greatest writers weep with envy, and always, he watched Demikos' face for some sign of genuine affection, some indication that he was valued for who he was rather than what he could do. That sign never came. Adequate, Damkos would say after reviewing Perturabo's latest architectural triumph. Perhaps next time you will manage something truly impressive. Functional, he would declare after watching his adopted son demonstrate a new siege engine design. Though I noticed several inefficiencies that a more experienced mind would have avoided. Never praise, never pride, never the simple acknowledgement that Perturabo was extraordinary, was gifted, was worthy of love for its own sake. Only the cold mathematics of utility, only the endless implication that he had not yet done enough to deserve what every child should receive freely. The other nobles of Olympia were hardly better. They saw Perturabo's inhuman capabilities and felt not wonder but fear, not gratitude but resentment. Here was a boy who could outthink their greatest philosophers, outbuild their master architects, outfight their veteran generals, and he wasn't even one of them. Not truly. He was an outsider, a fallen star, a reminder of their own limitations made flesh. They smiled to his face and whispered behind his back. They accepted his gifts while questioning his motives. They benefited from his genius, while making sure he never forgot that he would always be apart from them, always different, always alone. But there was one exception. One person on all of Olympia who looked at Perturabo and saw not a weapon or a threat or a useful tool, but simply him. Her name was Caliphone, Demikos' sister, younger by a decade, untouched by the tyrant's calculating coldness. Where her brother saw the Primarch's value, she saw his pain. Where others recoiled from his inhuman perfection, she reached through it to touch the desperately lonely child beneath. She was the first person to ever ask Perturabo how he felt rather than what he could do. "You look tired," she said one evening, finding him in his workshop after another 18-hour day of trying to earn Demikos' approval through architectural brilliance. "When did you last sleep?" Such a simple question, such a basic expression of care. And yet it hit Perturabo like a thunderbolt because no one had ever bothered to ask. In that moment, the Primarch who could calculate the stress tolerances of adamantium or design cities that would stand for millennia found himself speechless. I don't require much rest," he managed, the lie tasting bitter in his mouth. Caliphone smiled. Not the political smile he was used to, not the fearful grimace or calculating smirk, but something warm and genuine. "That wasn't what I asked. I asked when you last slept." And slowly, carefully, like a wounded animal learning to trust, Perturabo began to lower his guard. With Caliphone, he didn't have to perform, didn't have to justify his existence through achievement, didn't have to earn his place through constant proof of worth. She loved him, simply, purely, without condition or calculation. She saw through the Primarch's terrible isolation to the child who just wanted someone to care whether he lived or died. She was a light in his darkness, the one person who made him believe that maybe he was worthy of love just for being himself. But love, Perturabo was learning, could be the cruelest torture of all, because now he knew what he was missing. Now he understood the difference between Caliphone's warmth and D'Amico's ice. Now he could feel with crystal clarity just how alone he truly was. One person loved him out of thousands. One heart understood him out of millions. And that only made the silence from everyone else more deafening. Above them all, the Eye of Terror watched and waited. It had seen this pattern before. The exceptional child, desperate for approval. The cold father, withholding affection. The single source of love, precious beyond measure precisely because it was so rare. It knew how such stories ended. It knew what happened when that single source of light was finally extinguished. It knew that the deepest love could become the deepest hate, and that the most magnificent souls were often the ones that burned brightest when they fell. But not yet. Not tonight. Tonight, Caliphone still lived. Tonight, one person still saw Perturabo as worthy of love. Tomorrow, the real education and betrayal would begin. The Emperor came to Olympia like a storm made flesh. Ships that blotted out the sun, warriors in gold and crimson, the scent of ozone and divinity crackling through the air. But for Perturabo, standing on the battlements of Locos and watching the Imperium's endless armada descend, there was no wonder in the moment, only recognition. He had seen this face in dreams, had heard this voice in the space between heartbeats. The Eye of Terror had shown him fragments, glimpses of a golden giant who claimed dominion over the stars themselves. And now, as reality aligned with prophecy, Perturabo felt something he had never experienced before. He felt chosen, not by Damkos, who had taken him in for political advantage, not by the nobles of Olympia, who feared and resented his gifts, but by something vast and terrible and magnificent, striding across the galaxy with conquest in one hand and unity in the other. The meeting was formal, precise, wrapped in ceremony and protocol. The Emperor spoke of great crusades and lost sons, of humanity's destiny among the stars, and the role Perturabo would play in achieving it. But beneath the grand words, the Primarch heard something else. Something that resonated in his enhanced genetics like a tuning fork struck in the depths of his soul. Purpose. "You are my son," the Emperor said, and for one shining moment, Perturabo allowed himself to believe it meant what it should mean. Not utility, not calculation, but connection, family, the acknowledgement he had craved since falling from the heavens 29 years before. But gods, Perturabo was learning, were no more capable of true fatherhood than tyrants. The Legion was waiting. The Iron Warriors, they called themselves. 10,000 Astartes forged in the image of their lost Primarch, shaped by decades of warfare into something harder than adamantine and twice as unforgiving. They had fought without him across dozens of worlds, had bled and died and conquered in his name, and now they knelt before him as if he were the answer to every prayer they had never dared voice. Perturabo looked upon his sons and saw flaws, weakness disguised as strength, sentiment masquerading as discipline. They had forgotten that iron must be tested to be trusted, that only through breaking could true hardness be achieved. "Rise," he commanded, his voice carrying easily across the mustering ground. 10,000 warriors came to their feet as one, a symphony of ceramite and steel that should have filled him with pride. Instead, it filled him with disappointment. "You have grown soft," he continued, walking among the ranks like a judge pronouncing sentence. "You have forgotten that we are iron, that iron must be pure, that weakness, even the smallest trace of it, will corrupt everything it touches." The words came from somewhere deep in his genetic memory, from lessons encoded in his very DNA by a father who understood that sentiment was luxury and mercy was poison. But they also came from the Eye of Terror, whispering truths that cut deeper than any blade. You will be reminded, Perturabo said, draw lots, 1 in 10. The silence that followed was absolute, not the silence of understanding or acceptance, but the silence of horror slowly dawning. Some of the Iron Warriors had fought beside each other for decades. Some had shared blood and stories, and the kind of brotherhood that only comes from surviving held together. None of that mattered. Iron within, iron without. The weak would be culled, so the strong could flourish. The decimation took 3 hours. 3 hours of mechanical, methodical execution, as every 10th warrior knelt and received a bolt shell to the back of the head, delivered by the battle brother standing to his right. No ceremony, no speeches about honor or sacrifice, just the simple mathematics of necessary cruelty. By the end, the mustering ground was painted crimson. 1,000 of his sons lay dead, their gene seed harvested, their weapons redistributed, their names already being struck from the Legion's rolls. The survivors stood like statues, their faces hidden behind helmet lenses that reflected nothing but cold starlight. Now you remember, Perturabo said, his voice carrying no satisfaction, no regret, no emotion at all. We are iron. Iron does not bend. Iron does not break. Iron endures. The Emperor had watched it all in silence. When it was finished, when the bodies had been cleared and the ground scrubbed clean, he approached his newly found son with something that might have been approval in his ancient eyes. Harsh, the master mankind observed, but necessary. They will be stronger for it. Perturabo felt that familiar hunger stir in his chest, the desperate need for validation, for some sign that his father, his true father, understood what he had done and why. But the Emperor's praise fell as cold as Demikos' criticisms. Another calculation, another assessment of utility. They are iron now, Perturabo replied. Iron within, iron without. They will not fail again. No, the Emperor agreed. They will not. And then he was gone, departing Olympia with new orders and fresh conquests to oversee, leaving Perturabo alone with his legion and the weight of what he had just done. 1,000 dead sons. 1,000 futures ended with a single command. 1,000 names that would never again be spoken aloud. But iron, Perturabo told himself as he stood in the empty mustering ground, did not mourn. Iron did not second-guess. Iron simply endured, and in enduring, grew stronger. Above Olympia, the Eye of Terror pulsed with something that might have been satisfaction. It had watched the Primarch take his first step down a path that led only to damnation, had seen him choose necessity over mercy, strength over sentiment, iron over humanity. There would be more steps to come, more choices that cut away pieces of his soul in the name of efficiency, more moments when love would be sacrificed on the altar of utility. But this was the first, the precedent, the moment when Perturabo learned that to be truly strong, you must first kill everything weak in yourself, even if that weakness was the only thing that made you human. There is a particular exhaustion that comes not from doing what is difficult, but from doing what is necessary while everyone else does what is glorious. It settles in the bones like radiation, invisible but corrosive, eating away at the soul one unremarked victory at time. This was Perturabo's inheritance. This was his curse. Not death in battle, which would have been merciful, but endless life in the shadows of others' triumphs. The Great Crusade had begun, and with it, the iron lottery of assignment. Across the galaxy, Primarchs received their mandates like gifts from a generous father. Horus got the spirit of campaigns. The glory charges where victory meant adulation, and defeat meant martyrdom. Fulgrim received worlds of beauty to liberate, planets whose grateful populations would weep at the sight of their purple-clad saviors. Even Ongron, broken as he was, got the simple clarity of frontal assault, the clean mathematics of blade meeting blade. And Perturabo got the sieges. Not the quick ones, not the dramatic ones where walls fell in days and heroes were born in the breach. No, he got the grinding campaigns. The fortress worlds where victory was measured not in moments of glory, but in months of methodical starvation. The worlds where the only way forward was through miles of killing ground, over mountains of bodies, across rivers of blood that flowed for years without end. The Iron Warriors specialized in siege warfare. The Emperor had said, as if it were an honor rather than a sentence, "Your legion will break what others cannot even scratch." And so they did, world after world, system after system. Wherever the crusade encountered something too stubborn to die quickly, the call went out. Send Perturabo. Send the Iron Warriors. Send the ones who don't mind bleeding for months in trenches that never make it into the victory songs. Olympia became a distant memory as the Four Legion carved its way across hostile stars. Sebastusfor, where they spent 8 months digging through a necropolis fortress, while plague-dead defenders rose again and again from contaminated soil. Crade, where the walls stood 300 meters high, and every meter had to be taken with explosives and blood and the kind of mathematical precision that turned warfare into geometry. Incaladian, where the final assault lasted 72 hours of continuous combat through corridors so narrow that Astartes had to advance single file into the teeth of concentrated fire. Victories, all of them, complete, total, absolute victories that brought dozens of worlds into imperial compliance and added millions of new citizens to humanity's growing empire. But victories that came at a cost that could be measured in more than just blood. Every siege was a lesson in diminishing returns. Every fortress world taught Perturabo the same truth, that creation was harder than destruction, but destruction was more necessary. That while his brothers earned glory in single moments of triumph, he earned exhaustion in months of relentless, grinding warfare where the only reward for taking one wall was the opportunity to die taking the next one. The Iron Warriors adapted because they had to. Their gene seed was hardy, their discipline absolute, their capacity for absorbing casualties and continuing to fight without equal among the legions. But even iron could be worn down, given enough time and pressure. Even the strongest steel could develop stress fractures if hammered long enough. Perturabo watched it happen, watched his sons grow harder, colder, more efficient with each campaign. Watched the light fade from their eyes as they learned to see every fortress not as a challenge to overcome, but as a problem to solve through applied violence. Watched them stop counting their dead because the numbers had become too large to carry. They were becoming what he had made them in that first decimation. Iron within, iron without. But iron, he was learning, was not invulnerable. It was simply slow to break. The summons always came the same way. A priority astropathic transmission, encoded with authority codes that brooked no delay. The Four Legion is requested to, not ordered, not commanded, requested, as if Perturabo had a choice in the matter, as if the Emperor's most reliable siege specialist could simply decline to break another fortress because he was tired. But beneath the polite language lay the weight of expectation, the unspoken understanding that the Iron Warriors would go where they were sent, fight what they were told to fight, and win regardless of cost because that was what they did. That was their purpose, their identity, their curse. Other legions had specialties that brought them fame. The Imperial Fists were renowned for their defensive expertise, their ability to turn any position into an impregnable fortress. The White Scars were celebrated for their speed, their lightning raids that left enemies reeling. The Ultramarines were praised for their tactical flexibility, their ability to adapt to any battlefield condition, The Iron Warriors were known for getting results. Not elegant results. Not inspirational results. Just results. Worlds brought into compliance through methodical application of superior firepower, and absolute refusal to acknowledge the concept of acceptable losses. Perturabo is the one you call when you need something broken, other Primarchs would say, and they meant it as a compliment, as recognition of his particular gifts. But Perturabo heard it differently. He heard the subtext, the implication that he was useful rather than valued, that his legion existed to do the jobs no one else wanted to do, to shoulder the burdens no one else was willing to carry, to be the tool that got used and discarded when cleaner methods were available. 20 years of the Great Crusade. 20 years of siege after siege after siege, each one a masterpiece of applied violence and tactical precision. 20 years of watching his brothers earn accolades for single victories, while he accumulated dozens of conquests that no one remembered because they weren't glamorous enough to sing about. The Iron Warriors had become the most experienced siege force in human history. They could reduce any fortification, overcome any defense, break any enemy given enough time and ammunition. They were arguably the most effective legion in the crusade, certainly the most reliable, and they were dying, not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly, incrementally. Each siege took its toll. Each victory cost a little more than the last. Each world brought into compliance left a legion a fraction smaller, a degree harder, a measure more distant from anything that could be called human. But still the summons came. Still the fortress worlds waited. Still the galaxy demanded that someone do the necessary work of breaking what would not bend. And Perturabo, who had dreamed of building cities that would stand forever, found himself becoming the master of making cities that would fall. The irony was not lost on him. The architect of dreams, become the engineer of nightmares. The child who had seen paradise in mathematical perfection, now calculating the most efficient methods for turning stone into rubble and hope into despair. Above him, invisible and patient, the Eye of Terror watched his transformation with something approaching satisfaction. Each siege ground away another piece of the dreamer. Each victory carved away another fragment of the idealist who had once believed that beauty could triumph over entropy. Soon, the Eye whispered in moments between battles, soon there will be nothing left but iron. Iron within, eye without. Iron that knew only how to break things. And when that moment came, when the last vestige of the architect died in the soul of the siege master, then the real work could begin. There are betrayals that kill the body, and betrayals that kill the soul. But the cruelest betrayals are those that kill something in between, that wound the spirit so deeply that healing becomes impossible, leaving only the slow rot corruption where wholeness once lived. For Perturabo, this lesson came wrapped in friendship's embrace, delivered by a brother's smile, on a world where beauty had gone mad. The crone world of Laren hung in space like a jewel carved from poison. Once, it had been the crown of an Eldar empire whose artistry made even Perturabo's perfect geometries seem crude by comparison. Now it was a testament to excess, to the terrible things that happened when aesthetic perfection became an end unto itself. Every surface writhed with organic architecture that pulsed like living flesh. Every structure sang with harmonies that bypassed the ear and carved themselves directly into the brain. It was beautiful, hideously, transcendently, impossibly beautiful, and it made Perturabo sick to look at it. Magnificent, isn't it? Fulgrim said, standing beside his brother on the command bridge of the Pride of the Emperor. The Primarch of the Third Legion wore his wonder like a second skin, his perfect features lit with a kind of rapture that should have been reserved for religious experiences. Such artistry, such vision. No one of the Emperor's children were chosen to cleanse this place. Perturabo nodded, not trusting himself to speak, the world below hurt to perceive. Each vista a masterwork that his engineer's mind could analyze, but his architect's soul could never hope to match. Here was creation beyond anything he had ever dreamed. Here was beauty that would endure long after his bridges crumbled and his cities fell to dust. And here was the proof, written in alien stone and sinew, that he would never be more than a crude imitator of genius. "Join me," Fulgrim continued, his voice carrying a note of invitation that warmed something in Perturabo's chest that had been cold for too long. "Walk with me through their galleries. See what true artistry can accomplish when freed from the constraints of mere function." It was kindness. Simple, genuine kindness from a brother who understood the burden of aesthetic vision in a galaxy that valued only results. Fulgrim had always been different from the others. Where Horus offered political alliance and Dorn spoke of duty, Fulgrim offered something rarer. Appreciation, understanding, the recognition that Perturabo was more than just a siege master, more than just a breaker of walls. And so Perturabo walked with his brother through galleries that defied comprehension. They saw sculptures that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously. They heard music that played itself from crystalline formations that had grown from the bones of long-dead artists. They witnessed architecture that lived and breathed and dreamed, creating new forms of beauty even as they watched. "You could build something like this," Fulgrim whispered as they stood before a tower that spiraled up into infinity, its surface covered with equations that wrote themselves in languages that predated human civilization. "Your mind, your vision, freed from pedestrian concerns of siege warfare. Imagine what you could create." For a moment, Perturabo allowed himself to imagine, to dream of structures that would make even this alien artistry seem crude, to envision cities that would endure not through stubborn resistance to entropy, but through their own transcendent beauty, to hope, once again, that creation might triumph over destruction. That was when Fulgrim struck, not with blade or bolter, but with something far more intimate, far more personal. The ritual circle had been prepared in advance, hidden beneath illusions that even a Primarch's enhanced senses couldn't penetrate. The demon was waiting, hungry for the specific flavor of soul that only an architect-turned-destroyer could provide. "I'm sorry, brother," Fulgrim said, and the worst part was that he meant it. The sorrow in his voice was genuine, the regret real. "But you have something I need, something we need." The chains that bound Perturabo were not made of metal, but of warp stuff, ethereal bonds that held his spirit, while his body remained free to struggle uselessly. Around him, the Emperor's children began their chant, not the ritual words of some ancient religion, but something newer, more personal. The catalog of his failures, the litany of his inadequacies, the mathematical proof that he would never be more than a pale shadow of true genius. And through it all, the demon fed. Not on his life force, though that would have been easier to bear. Not on his memories, though those would have been precious enough. No, it fed on something more fundamental. It fed on his capacity for wonder, his ability to see beauty and be moved by it, his architect's soul, the part of him that still dreamed of creating something perfect. Perturabo felt it going, felt the slow, systematic extraction of everything that made creation possible, the spark that had driven him to build law codes, the vision that had shaped his perfect temples, the hope that had sustained him through decades of necessary destruction, all of it flowing out of him like blood from a severed artery, pooling in the ritual circle where it would be transformed into power. Power for the demon, power for Fulgrim, power for purposes that made a mockery of everything Perturabo had ever built or dreamed of building. "Stop," he whispered, the word torn from his throat like a piece of his soul. "Please." But Fulgrim was no longer listening. The demon prince that wore his brother's face was lost in ecstasy, drinking deep from the well of stolen inspiration. Around them, The Emperor's children continued their chant, their voices rising in harmonies that would have been beautiful if they hadn't been fueled by spiritual cannibalism. The extraction took hours. Hours of systematic violation, of piece-by-piece dismantling of everything that made Perturabo more than just another warlord with delusions of grandeur. When it was finished, when the last drop of wonder had been drained from his soul, Perturabo found himself changed. Not physically. The Primarch's body remained as perfect as ever, unmarked by the ordeal, but inside, where the architect had lived, there was now only emptiness, a hollow space where inspiration had once dwelt, a void where beauty had once kindled fire in his heart. He could still design, could still calculate stress tolerances and optimize siege engines, could still build after a fashion, but the spark that had driven him to create beauty was gone, leaving only the cold mathematics of utility. The part of him that had dreamed of paradise was dead, murdered by a brother's betrayal and a demon's hunger. "Thank you," Fulgrim said as the ritual circle dissolved and the chains of warp stuff faded like morning mist. "You have given me a gift beyond measure." Perturabo looked at his brother and felt nothing. No rage, no sorrow, no disappointment. Just a vast, echoing emptiness where emotions about beauty used to live. He could analyze what had been done to him, could understand the mechanics of spiritual violation, could even appreciate the elegance of the trap, but he could no longer care. "You're welcome," he said, and meant it, because caring about betrayal required a soul capable of valuing trust, and that part of him was gone now, consumed, transformed into power for purposes he would never comprehend. The wound never healed. How could it? You cannot restore what has been completely consumed. You cannot rebuild what has been transformed into someone else's power. You cannot heal a void, only learn to live with its emptiness. And so Perturabo learned to live without the part of his soul that had made him human, learned to build only for function, never again for beauty, learned that betrayal was not an aberration but a fundamental law of existence, as reliable as gravity and twice as cruel. Above him, the eye of terror pulsed with satisfaction. Another lesson learned. Another piece of the Primarch's humanity carved away. Another step toward the inevitable conclusion when iron would be all that remained, and iron would finally learn to embrace its true nature. The architect was dead. Long live the siege master. There are moments in every soul's journey when the path splits, when choice becomes destiny, and destiny becomes damnation. For some, this moment comes with fanfare, with grand declarations and dramatic gestures that mark the crossing of lines that can never be uncrossed. For Perturabo, it came with a Vox transmission. 3 words that would unravel everything he had ever built, everything he had ever loved, everything that remained of the man who had once dreamed of perfect cities beneath alien stars. Olympia is fallen. The sack-trotted deeps had been a graveyard long before the Iron Warriors arrived. A zone of space where reality grew thin, where time moved like molasses and entropy accelerated beyond natural law. Here, the Hrud had made their nest. Ancient, incomprehensible creatures that age matter with their very presence, that turn steel to rust and flesh to dust, simply by existing in proximity to it. The campaign should have lasted weeks. Should have been a quick purge, another efficient victory to add to the Iron Warriors' growing tally. Instead, it had become a nightmare of temporal distortion and cascading equipment failure, weapons that crumbled to powder mid-battle, armor that aged decades and minutes, warriors who entered combat as young men, and emerged, if they emerged at all, as wither husks barely capable of standing. Perturabo had watched his legion die by inches, not from enemy fire, but from time itself, from the simple, inexorable passage of moments that carved years from their lives with every breath. His sons, his iron-hard veterans, reduced the geriatric shadows of themselves as they pressed forward through terrain that made mockery of linear causality. But they had pressed forward, because that was what Iron Warriors did, because retreat was not in their vocabulary, because their Primarch had ordered them to purge the Hrud, and Iron Warriors did not fail. The cost had been catastrophic. 90,000 casualties. An entire generation of veterans aged into uselessness. Gene seed stocks depleted to levels that would take decades to restore. All for a handful of barren worlds that no one would ever visit again. No one would ever remember. No one would ever thank them for cleansing. And then, as Perturabo stood in the ruins of his legion's strength, as he calculated the years it would take to rebuild what the sack-trotted deeps had consumed, the transmission arrived. Lord Primarch. The astropath's voice crackled through layers of static and warp interference. Priority Alpha communique from Olympia. The planet is in open rebellion. The tyrant Damkos is dead. They had declared independence from the Imperium. The words hit Perturabo like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, but because they were inevitable, because somewhere in the depths of his enhanced mind, he had always known this moment would come, had seen in the eye of terror's malignant glow, had felt it approaching like a cancer in his soul. His home, his world, the place where he had built his first bridges and dreamed his first dreams, the soil that had nurtured the architect before the siege master consumed him, the people he had protected, had elevated, had loved in his own cold, distant way. They had turned against him. The rebellion is total, the astropath continued, his voice growing weaker as the psychic strain mounted. All major cities have fallen to insurgent forces. They are calling you a tyrant, a betrayer of Olympian independence. They say you abandoned them for your father's crusade. Abandon them. The words echoed in the hollow space where Perturabo's capacity for wonder used to live. Abandon them. When he had spent 30 years serving the Imperium's expansion, when he had bled his Legion White on 100 worlds to bring compliance to humanity's scattered children, when he had sacrificed everything, his dreams, his hope, his very soul, in service to something greater than himself, and they called it abandonment. There's more, my lord, the astropath whispered, his voice now barely audible above the static. The rebels they have taken hostages, members of the old nobility. Your sister Caliphone is among them. The transmission ended in a burst of psychic feedback that left the astropath convulsing on the deck. But Perturabo barely noticed. His mind had gone perfectly, crystalline clear, the kind of clarity that comes when every illusion falls away at once, leaving only truth in all its terrible simplicity. They had taken Caliphone, the one person who had ever loved him without condition, the one soul who had seen through his armor to the wounded child beneath, the last remaining connection to anything that could be called warmth in his frozen heart. And they would use her against him, would make her a symbol of their rebellion, would parade her before crowds that cheered for independence while she, innocent of any crime save loving the wrong brother, paid the price for his choices. Around him, the bridge of the Iron Blood fell silent. His officers, what remained of them after the sack-trotted deeps, waited for orders, waited for their Primarch to decide how to respond to this ultimate betrayal, this final proof that loyalty was a luxury the galaxy could not afford. Perturabo closed his eyes and felt the last fragments of his humanity crumble to dust, felt the final walls around his heart collapse inward, leaving only the iron core that had always been his true nature, the cold, calculating engine of pure logic that could make the hardest choices without flinching. When he opened his eyes again, they were the eyes of a stranger, the eyes of someone who understood that love was weakness, that mercy was poison, that the only response to betrayal was complete, total, absolute retaliation. Set course for Olympia, he said, his voice carrying the weight of inevitability. The sound of doors closing, bridges burning, choices becoming chains that would bind him for eternity. "All of it, my lord," his flag captain asked, though they both knew the answer. "All of it," Perturabo confirmed. "Burn it all." Behind him, invisible as always, the eye of terror pulsed with triumph. It had waited so long for this moment, had nurtured the Primarch's isolation, had fed his resentment, had guided him step by step toward this precipice where love and duty finally collided with the force of tectonic plates. Now there was nowhere left to fall but down into the darkness where architects became destroyers, where builders became breakers, where the last vestiges of humanity were finally, mercifully put to rest. The point of no return had been crossed. The die cast, the final lesson learned. Everything you love will betray you. Everything you build will be torn down. Everything you protect will turn against you in the end. Better to be the one holding the torch than the one being burned by it. Better to be the destroyer than the destroyed. Better to strangle your own soul than let someone else do it for you. Some murders are committed with weapons, others with words. But the cruelest murders of all are those committed with necessity, when love dies not from hatred, but from the simple mathematics of survival. Olympia burned beneath an iron sky. 3 days of orbital bombardment. 3 days of methodical destruction as the Iron Warriors reduced their birth world to ash and rubble. No warnings, no negotiations, no mercy for the billions who had called this place home. Perturabo watched from his flagship, watched cities that had stood since before the age of strife crumble in seconds, watched the bridges he had built as a child collapse into molten metal, watched his own history being erased one explosion at a time. He felt nothing. The part of him that could feel was already dead, murdered by Fulgrim's demon on a world of impossible beauty. All that remained was cold logic, the iron certainty that betrayal could only be answered with annihilation. When the bombardment ended, the drop pods descended, Iron Warriors hunting survivors, making sure that no trace of rebellion remained to poison future generations with false hope. In the deepest bunker of what had once been Locos, they found her. Caliphone knelt in the palace ruins, the woman who had been the only source of warmth in a cold child's life. The years had marked her, but her eyes still held impossible kindness. "Brother," she said when Perturabo entered, her voice steady, unafraid. Even now, she looked at him with gentle understanding. "You came home." The word struck something deeper, something he thought had died with the architect's dreams. "This was never home," he replied, voice empty of everything except cold truth. "Home is a lie. Family is a chain that binds us to weakness. Love is the cruelest lie of all." Caliphone rose slowly, ignoring the Iron Warriors surrounding them. Her attention focused entirely on the brother she had once comforted during nightmares. "What happened to you?" she whispered, reaching out as if to touch his face. "What did they do to my little brother?" For just a moment, something stirred. A flicker of the child who had dreamed of perfect cities. The boy who had built bridges to connect enemies. But then the iron reasserted itself. The bitter wisdom carved into his soul. "They taught me the truth," he said, hands rising to encircle her throat. "That everything ends, everything betrays, everything dies." Caliphone didn't struggle, didn't fight, simply looked into his eyes, searching for fragments of the brothers she remembered. "Not everything," she whispered. "I never stopped loving you." Her neck snapped with the sound of breaking kindling. Perturabo held her body for a long moment, feeling the absolute finality of what he had done. The last person who had ever loved him was dead, killed by his own hands. When he finally let her fall, something fundamental died inside himself. The last ember of warmth, the final whisper of hope. "Burn it all," he commanded, voice completely empty. Leave nothing. No records. No monuments. No graves. As Olympia died its final death, as the last traces of Perturabo's humanity were consumed in flames, the Eye of Terror pulsed with dark satisfaction. The transformation was nearly complete. The architect was dead, the dreamer silenced. Only the iron remained. Cold, hard, unbreakable iron that would never again make the mistake of loving anything enough to lose it. There is a particular agony reserved for those who achieve everything they ever wanted, only to have it stolen at the moment of triumph, not the pain of failure, but the deeper wound of success made meaningless. This was Perturabo's reward for breaking Terra itself. The Siege of Terra had been his masterpiece. While Horus postured and other Primarchs indulged their obsessions, Perturabo did what he had always done. He solved the problem. The palace walls were impossible. Rogel Dorn had spent decades turning the Imperial Palace into the greatest fortress in human history. Layer upon layer defenses, kill zones stretching for kilometers, void shields powered by the planet's core itself. But Perturabo saw what others could not. The mathematical weakness hidden in Dorn's perfection. The single point of failure that his brother's obsession had created. 3 months of siege work that redefined what was possible. Artillery barges calculated to the millisecond, mining operations that carved through bedrock, assault patterns that turned the palace's defenses against itself. He broke the unbreakable. The Eternity Gate fell to his guns. The ultimate wall crumbled under his barrage. The throne room itself lay open for the first time in 10,000 years, standing in the breach he had carved. Looking upon Dorn's shattered masterpiece, Perturabo felt something he had not experienced since childhood. Vindication. Proof that function trumped form. That the siege master would always triumph over the architect of pretty walls. Magnificent work, Horus said, approaching through smoke and debris. You have achieved the impossible. For a moment, Perturabo allowed himself to believe this time would be different, that his efforts would finally be recognized. The palace is broken, he replied carefully. The final assault can begin. Yes, Horus agreed, his tone carrying warning. But perhaps fresh leadership is needed for such a crucial moment. I have brought Mordorion forward. His Death Guard will lead the assault on the throne room. The words hit like bolter rounds. Fresh leadership. As if breaking the palace had been mere preparation. As if the impossible part was just preliminary work. You understand, this is a moment for passion. For fury. Not for technical expertise, Horus continued. Technical expertise. The phrase dripped with dismissal, as if everything Perturabo had accomplished was just mechanical skill. Around them, Iron Warriors stood in perfect formation, his sons who had bled to make this moment possible, who had followed him into impossible defenses because they believed their sacrifice mattered. Now, they would watch someone else claim victory. The Iron Warriors will consolidate our gains, Horus said generously. Hold the breach while Mordorion advances. Essential work. Essential, like a building's foundation. Necessary but invisible. Vital but unremarked. Of course, Perturabo said, voice perfectly controlled. The Iron Warriors will hold. And they did. For 6 hours. They held while Mortarion's plague marines stumbled through corridors Perturabo had mapped. While the Death Guard claimed glory for walking paths Iron Warriors had carved with blood, when it was over, the chronicles would speak of Horus's triumph, of Mortarion's assault. The Iron Warriors would be a footnote. The siege master who made it all possible would be, if remembered at all, competent support, standing in Terra's broken fortress, surrounded by evidence of his genius turned to destruction. Perturabo finally understood the truth the Eye of Terror had been teaching him. Victory meant nothing if others controlled the narrative. Achievement was worthless serving someone else's glory. Loyalty was just another word for being used. He had broken the unbreakable, proven himself the greatest siege master in history, and none of it mattered, because he had done it for people who saw him as a tool. Above Terra's broken skies, the eye of terror pulsed with approval. Another lesson learned, another illusion shattered. If you're going to be used, use others first. If you are going to be betrayed, make the betrayal serve your purposes. If you are going to be forgotten, make sure they never forget the price of dismissing you. The architect of victory had built his last triumph for ungrateful masters. What he built next, he would build for himself alone. There's an art to revenge that transcends mere violence. It requires patience, precision, and intimate understanding of your enemy's greatest strength. The most exquisite vengeance is not destroying what they hate, but corrupting what they love most. For Perturabo, that meant giving Rogel Dorn exactly what he wanted. The iron cage was not built in anger. It was designed with cold perfection that only comes from absolute understanding. An understanding of Dorn's psychology that ran deeper than brotherhood, deeper than rivalry. Sebastus IV was a dead world, barren rock and poison atmosphere, strategically worthless except for one crucial detail. It lay directly in Dorn's pursuit path, the perfect location for what Perturabo had in mind. The fortress rose like a geometric nightmare. 20 square kilometers of interlocking kill zones, overlapping fields of fire, corridors that funneled attackers into prepared graves. But it was more than a fortress. It was a statement written in adamantium, a philosophical argument made manifest. You think defense is about walls. Perturabo whispered walking the ramparts, about standing firm, refusing to yield. But defense is about making the enemy pay such a price that winning becomes indistinguishable from losing. The iron cage was not designed to be impregnable. Dorn would see the flaws, the intentional weaknesses. His genius would identify assault routes, calculate casualties, determine victory was possible at acceptable cost. That was the trap. Perturabo knew his brother better than Dorn knew himself. The pride beneath that stoic exterior, the desperate need to prove Imperial Fist discipline could overcome anything, the belief that duty demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice ennobled the sacrificer. The astropathic message was brief, taunting, perfectly calculated. Brother, I have built something for you. Come and see what true architecture looks like. Come and learn why walls built by fools always fall. The response came in thunder of drop pods. The Imperial Fist had taken the bait. From his command bunker, Perturabo watched the first wave hit outer defenses, watched yellow-armored figures advance through killing fields, watched automated defenses thin their ranks with mechanical precision. They kept coming, because they were Imperial Fists, and Imperial Fists did not retreat. First day cost 300 Marines. Second day, 500 more. By week's end, thousands dead. But still they pressed forward, gaining meters at the cost of lives, purchasing ground with blood. Perturabo could have ended at any time, could have unleashed his fleet, activated orbital platforms, could have turned the cage into a crater. But that would have been crude. Instead, he waited, watched Dorn throw wave after wave against defenses that yielded just enough to keep hope alive. You see it yet? He whispered into the Vox. Do you understand what I built? The iron cage was a mirror, a reflection of everything Dorn believed about duty and sacrifice. Each dead Imperial Fist was proof of loyalty. Each meter gained was evidence of courage. Each day of attrition was validation of their creed. And that was the cruelest aspect. It gave Dorn exactly what his psychology demanded. The perfect stage for Imperial Fist virtue, at a cost that would cripple his legion for centuries. 3 weeks of methodical slaughter. When Gilliman finally arrived to break the siege, the Imperial Fists had technically won. They held the iron cage. But 400 dead, thousands wounded, gene seed depleted, a generation of veterans reduced to memory, all for a worthless fortress Perturabo abandoned the moment it served its purpose. He had given Dorn everything he wanted, and in doing so, inflicted a wound that would never heal. The knowledge that his virtue had been weaponized against him. The iron cage was Perturabo's masterpiece, not of architecture, but of psychology, a trap that worked because the prey helped build it. There comes a moment in every fall when the last vestige of what you were must be sacrificed on the altar of what you will become. When the final choice presents itself, not between good and evil, but between remaining weak or embracing necessity. For Perturabo, that moment came with 400 Imperial Fist gene seeds spread across his laboratory table like scattered pearls. The ritual had been years in preparation. Not crude barbarism, but something precise, mathematical, an equation written in flesh and spirit that would solve the final problem of mortality itself. To become a demon prince required sacrifice, not just any sacrifice, but the willing destruction of everything that had once defined you as human. And what better sacrifice than the genetic legacy of the brother who had always claimed moral superiority? Gene seed is more than biology, Perturabo murmured as he began preparations. It is potential, dreams, the future made manifest in genetic code. Each seed represented a life that would never be, an Imperial Fist who would never stand upon walls, a son of Dorn who would never learn the mathematics of duty. 400 futures, snuffed out before they could begin. The demon that came was ancient beyond measure. It had watched civilizations rise and fall, had seen gods born and murdered. You offer much, it whispered, but do you understand price? To ascend, you must become what you despise most. Perturabo looked at the gene seeds, then at his hands that had once built bridges, and smiled without warmth. I already have. The ritual began at midnight. Each gene seed burned in warp fire, their essence transformed from hope into power, from future into fuel. The pain was exquisite, not physical agony, but the systematic destruction of every illusion about himself, every pretense of nobility, every fragment of the architect who had dreamed of paradise. It all burned away in the crucible of ascension. When finished, Perturabo felt the change begin. His flesh transcended mortal limitations. But it was not his body that changed most dramatically. It was his perspective. Suddenly, he could see the galaxy as it truly was. Not worlds to be conquered, but a vast machine designed for suffering. Every war was a gear. Every death was fuel. Every hope was kindling. And he was no longer trapped within the machine. He had become part of its mechanism. A demon prince with power to reshape reality, bound to no master save his own will. The Iron Warriors found him 3 days later in the laboratory ruins. Where once their Primarch had stood, now there was something greater, something that wore his face but burned with fires that had never known starlight. My sons, he said, his voice carrying harmonics that made reality shiver. We have work to do. The price of ascension had been paid. The architect was finally, completely, utterly dead. Long live the demon prince. In the eye of terror, where time has no meaning and space folds like origami, there stands a fortress that defies comprehension, not built upon a world, but carved from one, a planet transformed into a single impossible structure that serves as monument to futility of all ambition. This is Medringard, and it is Perturabo's hell. 10,000 years have passed since his ascension. 10,000 years of building, creating, designing structures that dwarf anything the Imperium has ever conceived. Towers that pierce the warp itself. fortresses existing in 17 dimensions, siege engines the size of continents. And every single one, without exception, is flawed, not through lack of skill. Perturabo's abilities have transcended mortal comprehension. He shapes matter with thought, bends space with will, creates fortresses that laugh at physics. But the curse that followed him since childhood has become literal truth in Ascension. Nothing he builds lasts. Nothing endures. Every masterpiece begins crumbling the moment it's completed, not through external force, but through fundamental flaws in its own perfection. Again, he whispers, standing in ruins of his latest attempt. A cathedral fortress that would have dwarfed the Imperial Palace. Reduced to rubble by its own impossible geometry. Build again. The Iron Warriors obey. What else can they do? Their Primarch is no longer bound by mortality. He is a demon prince, a god of iron and siege, with eternity to perfect his craft. But eternity is not long enough. The irony is perfect. The architect who dreamed of permanence has been cursed with infinite time and power, and absolute certainty that nothing he creates will endure. Every fortress falls. Every tower topples. Every bridge collapses. Not through enemy action, but through the fundamental nature of entropy. Even demon princes cannot defeat the second law of thermodynamics. My lord, an iron warrior approaches, face replaced by mechanical components, loyalty hammer harder than adamantium through millennia of service. The outer batteries report Imperial forces, possibly a crusade fleet. Perturabo turns from his latest failure. For a moment, something like interest flickers, the promise of siege work. Problem solved through applied violence. Enemies that can be broken rather than creations that break themselves. Mobilize the Legion, he commands. All of it. But even as he speaks, calculating trajectories and kill zones, he knows the truth. This crusade will be destroyed. These enemies broken. These fortifications will fall. And then, inevitably, he will return to Medrengard, will begin building again, will create new impossibilities that collapse under their own perfection, will continue the endless cycle that defines his existence. He is the Lord of Medrengard, master of the Iron Warriors, demon prince of chaos undivided. He has achieved everything he ever wanted: infinite power, eternal existence, the ability to create wonders beyond imagination. And he is utterly, completely, eternally alone, still building, still destroying, still unable to create anything that lasts. The child who saw hell in the sky has become its architect. The dreamer who wanted to build paradise has created his own damnation. The Primarch who strangled his soul with his own hands continues, even now, to tighten the grip. In the eye of terror, Perturabo builds, and builds, and builds, and everything he touches turns to ash, as it always has, as it always will, forever.